Here we have a quiz component which is iterating over a whole bunch of questions, and we're using the value of the type of the question to decide to render either a true-false component or a multiple choice component. Now, each one of these, whether it's true-false or multiple choice, right, they both want to be able to render the details about the question, right? Each one has its own question, it has a correct answer. The true-false question has just two options, true, false, whereas the multiple choice might have multiple choices, lots and lots of choices that we need to iterate over. So let's see how we can pass the object that is being used to render this question. We need to pass it down to the components so that those components can then decide how to render them specifically. Right. So let's pass the question that we're iterating over. Right. If we see we see here, right, we're iterating over the questions, and we're binding each one of the questions to this local question object. We would like to pass this question down to each one of the components, and then have the components decide, what to do with that particular question. So let's do that. So the way we do that is that each one of the components needs to declare a variable where they can receive the data that is being passed to it. So let's see first how we can pass it down to the component. The way we're going to do it is that we're going to use an attribute, right? And the attribute needs to be in square brackets. Square brackets means that data is flowing into the component, right? And parentheses means that data is flowing out of the component. So here, because the question attribute is receiving the data from outside, right? We have the square brackets. So presumably there's going to be a variable in that component called question that we want to bind to, right? And we're going to bind it to this question object, right, that we're iterating over, so in effect we are passing this question instance that has this scope. We're passing it down to a child scope that's going to receive it. Okay, we're going to do the same thing for the other question, the multiple choice question. Right now it's complaining. It's saying, hey, I don't see a field called question that is receiving this attribute, right? So let's go into that component and configure that, right? So if we go into the true false, right, to be able to configure receiving the data from the outside scope, we need to declare a variable, and the variable will be the same name of the variable, right? It's question. Okay, which we're going to initialize as an empty object, right? So we definitely have to declare the variable, but also we need to annotate it, right? We have to tell the component that this is no normal state variable, right? Instead, it's a variable that is bound to an outer scope, right? It's bound to the iteration, right, that is iterating over a whole bunch of questions, and then that variable is being passed as reference to this variable over here. To do that, we're going to annotate it using the input annotation, right? Okay, and now it's bound to that variable up there. We have to do the same thing for the other component, the multiple choice. So we go down to the multiple choice. Notice that here is no longer complaining. So here's the multiple choice. We're going to do the same thing. It's going to receive the same question. Right. Once we have it in there, we can then perhaps use it in the component, so that instead of rendering this silly default content, right, we can perhaps render information about the actual question. Right, we can say question, maybe the title, right, and let's copy that, right, and let's do the same thing for the multiple choice. We can go to the HTML, right, and replace that, and at least render the title. All right, excellent. So let's head over back here. Notice that indeed we are rendering the title for the question. Notice that it's the same value that we were rendering outside, right? If we see when we're iterating the question, the quiz, right? Notice that we were having the title and the type, and then each one of the components is now rendering information about its own question. So we can actually remove this. We don't need this anymore. right? The title is being entirely rendered inside of each one of the components, right? So they do actually receive that data from the outside.